Has the evidence for evolution been smashed to bits? If you'd like to find out, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Genetomix. My name is Tim. We're going to be doing something a bit different on the channel today. We're going to be reacting to a video that came my way, popped up in my feed about 3 weeks ago. The video is called Evolution versus the Evidence, Viral Professor's 15-minute smashing of evolutionary theory. The professor in question is called Major Coleman. He's a professor of law and also has some degrees in social sciences, I understand. So let's have a step through the video and see what we think about the evidence that's being presented.
Let me ask you this question, which is, why are you so interested in this biblical story as opposed to any other biblical story?
Well, that is because, first of all, Jesus believed in the flood model, and it's the basis for the entire authenticity of the Bible. If you can prove that the Genesis story is false, you have destroyed the entire belief system on which Christianity is based. So that's why we use this model to show people that Noah's Ark was real and that the story is true.
Okay, so we've already run into our first issue here. So I don't actually think that this is necessarily the mainstream Christian viewpoint on this. This seems to be a young Earth Creationist approach. That's my guess at the moment, given that we're already talking about Noah's Ark. I don't think this necessarily follows, and there are a lot of Christians that accept evolution as scientific fact, but are still happy to believe in God and follow Christian teachings. The fundamental problem you've got with young Earth creationism is, first of all, you have to deny all the biology, so all of the evolution. But secondly, you also have to deny vast amounts of other evidence showing how old the universe and the Earth is. In order to make any kind of argument here, I think you've got to first mischaracterize evolution, and then secondly, cherry pick wildly amongst the available evidence to find those 2 or 3 small bits that support your position, and then ignore everything else. So that's my prediction for what's coming up in this video.
Well, couldn't the story have been symbolic, metaphor for other kinds of events that took place? How about creation? Couldn't that have been symbolic or metaphorical in the language that's there?
Well, it is possible, but when we look at the 4 postulates of creation and we compare them with the 4 postulates of evolution, only the postulates of creation have been observed. Evolution is based on 4 major ideas. None of them have ever been observed.
Okay, so we're getting to the meat of the argument. We're using postulates here. In law, to postulate means to assume, claim, or assert a premise as true or necessary without initial proof, often serving as a fundamental, self-evident basis for legal reasoning, argument, or a hypothesis. It's an essential foundational assumption upon which legal theories are built, according to Google. Science is not based on postulates. It's based on scientific theories, which are well-substantiated explanations of some aspect of the natural world that are based on a vast body of evidence, confirmed through repeated observation and experimentation, and can be used to make predictions. So scientific theories are falsifiable and make positive predictions. So in science, we don't assume things are true and then move forward. We look at the facts and we come up with explanations that best fit all of the available facts and evidence that we can find. The other claim that's being made here is that none of these postulates of evolution that we're about to have a look at have ever been observed, whereas the postulates of creation have been. So let's have a look.
Number 1, that life comes from non-life. We have not one single example of life coming from non-life.
Okay, so I predicted that we would start off by mischaracterizing evolution, and that's exactly where we've begun. So the study of how life got started in the first place, how life came from non-life, is called abiogenesis, and abiogenesis is not evolution. Evolution is just the change of heritable characteristics of biological populations over successive generations, or in more technical terms, it's the change of allele frequencies in populations over time. Nowadays, the theory of evolution is a whole bunch of scientific explanations that were built on the initial findings of Charles Darwin way back when, and then extended into what we call the modern synthesis, using the findings from Gregor Mendel. So we included genetics with Darwin's descent with modification. And since that time, we've learned a lot more about developmental genetics and genomics, in particular with the age of sequencing that we're now in, and being able to determine the genetic code and read the sequences. As you can see, even from this incredibly simplified summary, there's probably a lot more than 4 postulates going on within the theory of evolution. It's a fairly complex topic. But even more fundamentally, I don't see how life coming from non-life is a postulate that only impacts evolution. Life has to come from non-life, whichever model you're looking at, whether it's creation or evolution. So I think what the postulate should be saying is that life has come from non-life without any apparent intervention of somebody else. But that's not what our professor said. As it turns out, the field of abiogenesis is extremely interesting. It is one of the emerging scientific fields out there. There's lots that we still don't know about how life got started from non-life. But we may never know for certain exactly how it happened, because it happened almost 4 billion years ago and there wasn't anybody around to see what happened then. But there are some extremely promising research directions and lots of papers being published in the field. I'll come back and summarize abiogenesis in another video. So, postulate number 1, it's not evolution. What's next?
Number 2, that all the life forms that we have today came from single-cell life forms. Many people do not know that while we do have single-cell life forms that we call bacteria, we have no 2-celled life forms, we don't have 3-cell life forms, we don't have 4-cell life forms, we don't even have 5-cell life forms. That is, we go from single-cell bacteria to complex life forms. So there's no evidence that all life comes from single-cell life forms.
Okay, so this claim is just flatly wrong. I mean, first of all, the only single-cell life forms you mentioned are bacteria, but there are lots of other single-cell life forms out there. There are single-celled eukaryotic life forms. Amoeba is an example, which you've probably heard of. Now, we are eukaryotes. We have much more complex cells than bacteria do, but so do amoeba. Amoeba also have extremely complex and much larger cells than the bacteria do. So we can already see a gradation of complexity even within single-cell life forms. And 5 minutes on Google turns up Tetrabenna socialis, which is a 4-celled algae. But Professor Coleman made the claim that we don't even have 4-celled life forms, but we do. We have Tetrabenna, the colonial organisms consisting of 4 cells arranged in a square. So it's notable for being the colonial species with the smallest number of cells, 4, placing it on the boundary between single and multicellularity. So we absolutely do have 4-celled organisms. We have lots of other examples of organisms with a few more cells than that, and a few more, and so on. Again, there is a gradation of complexity of life, but also, fundamentally, there's another argument to be made here, which is that we do know of very complex organisms that started off as a single cell. That includes you and me, and Major Coleman, where we all started off as a single fertilized cell. And then not long after that, the cell divided and we were 2 cells. And then they all divided and we were 4 cells. And so on and so on. During our development and growth, we grew to the point where we are today, where we've got about 35 trillion human cells in our bodies. So that does ask a more fundamental question. Why do we always grow from a single cell? Why do all of the complex organisms we see on the planet grow from a single cell? You don't necessarily have to, right? As an adult human organism, I have all of the cells of the various tissue types already present in my body. Why does our reproduction not work by creating a small copy of ourselves from our existing tissues with everything already in place? Why do we always start from a single cell? Could it be that if you go far enough back in our evolution, that is what we were? We started from a single cell and then got more complex over time. So unfortunately, this postulate is factually wrong on several counts.
The third postulate of evolution is that time and chance drive evolution forward, of course, and time works against evolution. The chance of one simple 100-unit protein coming together by accident this is a very big number. Time and chance make evolution absolutely impossible.
So once again, we have a mischaracterization of evolution. There are chance processes involved in evolution, most notably random mutation. We can't predict where and when mutations are going to happen. But the process of selection, be it artificial selection by human beings or natural selection by the environment, are the opposite of random Natural selection is the increased likelihood of survival based on traits within a population. Those organisms that are the best fit for their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. If they have a particularly advantageous trait, they'll pass it on to their offspring, who in turn will be more likely to survive and reproduce, which will then spread the frequency of those genes through the population. The odds of assembling a 100 amino acid protein from scratch, de novo, are completely nonsense, because nobody is suggesting that that's how it happened. Indeed, going back to abiogenesis briefly, one of the most promising hypotheses there is the RNA world hypothesis, which is saying that there was no protein to begin with. It was all just RNA. There was no DNA, there's no protein, it's just RNA. RNA is both capable of storing genetic code and acting as an enzyme, in which case it's called a ribozyme. So again, we have a mischaracterization. Evolution is not chance only. Nobody's suggesting that proteins just popped into existence 100 amino acids long.
The fourth postulate that evolution is based on is that what we see today, minor genetic variation in species, is evidence of macroevolution. So because cats are different colors, dogs are different sizes, that means that fish turned into cows. And of course, we know that that's not true, because Mendel proved that all the genes that exist today, you can shuffle them around, but there are no new genes that were created.
So even young Earth creationists are being forced to admit that microevolution occurs. I mean, that is evolution, right? So change in allele frequencies in a population over time is evolution. That's the definition that we looked at earlier. So yes, small changes can happen over small periods of time. Is it therefore, incomprehensible that we give it more time, that these small changes will accumulate and eventually become major changes? That's all that the theory of evolution is saying. The speciation, the creation of new species, is something that usually takes a lot of time, especially for long-lived creatures such as ourselves. For short-lived creatures such as bacteria, we can observe speciation much more readily, and it has been observed several times in the laboratory. Speciation has also been observed in larger creatures as well. There are dozens of well-documented speciation events in the scientific literature. But we can also see evidence of common ancestry within our genetic information. So if we look at our genes as humans, our genes are more similar to other apes than they are to, say, the cats and the dogs, or the fish. As you move further away from us in the evolutionary tree, the differences become more and more. And this doesn't just apply to genes, but it also applies to pseudogenes and non-functional genes. It applies to endogenous retrovirus sequences, which are ancient viral infections that are still present in our genomes. And the more closely related you are to another species, the more similar these genetic sequences will be. He mentioned that no new genes are created, but again, we've observed this dozens of times. One of the most well-known examples is the evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Right? So antibiotics were only introduced in the 1920s and only became mass-produced in around the 1940s. And since then, bacteria have evolved antibiotic resistance. This is new genes that have been created. It's not just in bacteria that we've seen the evolution of new genes, it's in many, many species. Again, there are dozens of examples in the scientific literature. So we did start off this section by saying that none of these postulates of evolution have been observed, but at least two of them that we've looked at have been observed. We do see simpler multicellular organisms, we have seen speciation, we have seen new genes being formed. But the overall summary is a large-scale mischaracterization of evolution, and the statement that we don't observe these things when we do.
Let's think about the four major postulates of creation. Number one, where there's a design, there must be a designer. We see codes in DNA. Codes are evidence of intelligence because you have to translate from one language to another. We have not a single example of that happening by accident.
Okay, so we're kicking off with the argument from design. The problem with this immediately is that if you go into postulate design, you need to also have a candidate for the designer. So we need evidence for the existence of a designer as well as evidence of existence of a design. The genetic code we're able to generate by sequencing DNA is a representation of what's going on in the chemistry. So ultimately within DNA, we have nucleotides forming a sequence. So what's going on is actually chemistry. Now we can represent these as letters, A's and C's and G's and T's. It has to be taken into account that this is just a representation. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of non-functional code within the genome. Only a few % of it actually does anything useful. This is not a hallmark of a good or efficient design. And if you look at something like software code, when we look at how that's created, we always have a chain of proper evidence that we can use to see where that code came from, all the way from requirements that have been written down, that have come in from customers, and then converted into technical designs, and then from there into implementation, actual coding, which is usually commented by the developers and the software engineers who create it, and then the test cases that are created by testers and executed to demonstrate that the code is actually working the way it was designed to. We have a paper trail that goes back that shows the involvement of everybody throughout the whole process. So not only can we show that the code was designed, we can show that it was designed by a certain person at a certain point in time. So we have an identified designer and we have documentation of the design process. It's pretty good evidence. So when we're looking at the design of life, again, who's the designer and where is the evidence for the design? Magic man did it using magic is not a testable hypothesis.
Number two, that the Earth, the solar system, the universe, and the galaxy are young, measured in thousands of years, not millions or billions of years. Many times people ask me, they say, well, Major, you believe in a young Earth, a 6,000-year Earth. Can you show me that that's true without using the Bible? And I say, absolutely.
So the first thing to note about this postulate is that this is nothing to do with creation. This is a postulate for the young Earth. Nothing in this section is contrasting creation versus evolution.
What's the oldest living thing on the planet? The oldest living thing on the planet? Trees. How old are the oldest trees? 4,500 years. That takes us back almost exactly to the year of the flood, okay, in 2500 BC.
Remarkable.
I mentioned there would be cherry picking to fit preconceived notions. The preconceived notion here is the age of the planet, which was calculated by Bishop Ussher to be around 6,500 years, based on the genealogy of the characters in the Bible. So what we're trying to do here is to pick and choose amongst bits and bobs, data items, to try and find something that supports this 6,500-year-old date. This is the opposite of how science works. We're starting with a preconceived notion, we're cherry-picking only the data that fits, and we're ignoring all the evidence that contradicts that position. On that front, let's talk about trees. Right? Dendrochronology is the science of using tree rings to calculate ages. We have at least 3 different sites on the planet where we've gone back 13,000 years unbroken using tree rings only, counting backwards using tree rings. That would not have been possible if all the trees were killed by a global flood. And 13,000 years is double the projected age of the Earth. That's just from tree rings. Ice core dating goes back over 120,000 years for Greenland and over 800,000 years for Antarctica. And again, no signs of a global flood in the ice core data. We have multiple methods of radiometric dating. We can use carbon dating to go back tens of thousands of years, and we can use other dating methods such as uranium-lead dating to go back billions of years. Uranium-lead dating of the oldest rocks that we're able to date puts the age of the Earth at around 4.5 billion years.
Number two, I'm saying, look at the sky. We call solar nebulae. A solar nebula is what we see from a supernova when a star explodes. It leaves a gas cloud. Because of our radio telescopes that we have now today, we can look deep into space and we can actually count the number of solar nebulae that are there. And how many are there? A supernova takes place about once every 26 years. How many solar nebulae do we have? 6,000 years worth. That's impossible in a universe that is billions and billions of years old.
We have independent evidence from cosmology about the age of the universe, which is 13.8 billion years old, at least from the point of the Big Bang. We can observe the rate of expansion of the universe and then extrapolate backwards in time and to see how old it must be and where it must have come from. We can also calculate the age of the universe from cosmic background radiation. A quick Google search, how many nebulae are there in the universe? Trillions upon trillions. In our Milky Way galaxy alone, scientists estimate there's 20 to 30,000. Only about 3,000 to 3,500 actually catalogued. Even if we accept this supernova every 26 years number, I don't know where that's come from, to be honest. with 3,000 known in the Milky Way galaxy, we're already up way over 75,000 years.
And we have other evidences, such as alpha decay, that we do in our program that most people don't understand, that also shows that the Earth is 6,000 years old. So that's the second postulate that proves that the biblical story of creation is true.
Absolutely no idea what the alpha particle comment was about. Radioactive decay is an extremely well-known process. It's used in the radiometric dating techniques I mentioned earlier. In summary, we've moved away from creation versus evolution, and we're cherry-picking data and ignoring vast amounts of evidence, including denying physics, chemistry, geology, geochemistry, cosmology, dendrochronology, ice core dating, among others.
Life that we see today are the basic kinds of animals and plant life that were originally created. So we can test that. You can breed dogs, you can breed cats, but you can't breed cats with dogs. So there are limits to how far we can go.
And the very definition of a species in biology is, at least for larger animals such as ourselves, is two populations that are no longer able to interbreed with one another. Evolution doesn't suggest that cats can breed with dogs. Evolution suggests that cats and dogs have a common ancestor. If you go far enough back, you have creatures of the clade Carnivore who are neither cats nor dogs, and over time, those populations became distinct, and some of them evolved into cats, some of them evolved into dogs. And again, the genetic evidence shows common ancestry. Absolutely clear. The statement that what we see today was the species that were originally created is just false. I also know that no evidence has been presented to support this claim.
And lastly, that is, Earth experienced a worldwide flood in approximately 2500 BC, 1656 years after the world was created. The world is filled with limestone. Limestone is sedimentary rock. It precipitates out of water. The entire Earth was filled with water. Every mountain chain in the world, including Everest, has sea life on top of that mountain. The mountains rose out of the water, so we know that there was a worldwide flood.
So our final postulate, again, has absolutely nothing to do with creation versus evolution. This is simply apologetics about the flood. We have continuous dendrochronology data that goes back 13,000 years. We have ice core data with no signs of a global flood. We even have extant civilizations that were not wiped out by the flood, and we have continuous records from those, including civilizations in China, Egypt, and India, among others. So again, we have a completely irrelevant postulate that was based on something that absolutely didn't happen.
Let me pose a question to you, and Mark and Lise, feel free to jump in this. And that is this. Most people who don't believe in God aren't card-carrying members of the atheist club. They haven't studied molecular biology.
Yes.
Why don't they believe in God? What is the struggle there?
Neil, I'm going to tell you, that's a very good question. My answer to that is probably because most of them has not actually seen the evidence that supports the Bible. And that is my job, to actually show them. You're right, most people are somewhere drifting, somewhere in the middle. This is a war for ideas. And it's my job to combat these forces of error, particularly in secular campuses, in universities, which is where I work and teach, and show that the evidence supports God's word. God is a God of science.
So as somebody with a scientific background, I find this kind of thing pretty annoying. Right? This is science denial. Right? This is almost as bad as flat Earth. You have to start with preformed conclusions, do vast amounts of cherry picking, and ignore huge amounts of established science. As he said right at the beginning, he's tied science denial to his entire identity, his whole religious identity. This story of creation and the flood is all wrapped up. If it's not true, then the whole thing comes crashing down, at least according to him. This is like a gateway drug to science denial. You're building mistrust of science and scientists into the religious identity of all of your followers. So what happens when we have a global pandemic, or we start talking about autism, we start talking about climate change? We have a whole population of people who've been raised to distrust science and scientists. It's really dangerous and it's totally unnecessary. At the same time, there are plenty of religious people who are also scientists and are quite capable of reconciling the two viewpoints for themselves. Anyway, I found that extremely unconvincing. I hope you enjoyed this kind of stuff. If you do, then please let me know in the comments below. There's a link to the original video, plus my Patreon and my social media. They're all in the description below. Thanks very much for joining me, and I'll see you again next time.